Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let us get ready for our fourth plenary session. My name is Justus Wessler. I'm the professor for agricultural economics and rural policy at Wageningen University. And it is my great pleasure to chair the session here today on the war in the Ukraine and implications for agricultural and energy markets. We have four eminent speakers, experts on the topics that will share their insights on how to interpret the situation as it looks now. We have the four speakers: Maximo Torrero, he's the chief economist at the FAO. We have Alfons Balmann, he is professor at the Institute for Agricultural Economics in Middle and Eastern Europe. We have Roel Jongeneel, he is researcher at Wageningen Economic Research and professor at Wageningen University. And we have Vincent Smith, who is professor at Montana State University and at the same time also the director for agriculture and climate at the American Enterprise Institute. Now all the speakers will have 15 minutes and then we will take questions and comments at the end of the presentations. Now I would like to invite Maximo Torrero to kick off the session. Maximo, the floor is yours, please.
Oh, thank you so much, and apologies I couldn't be with you today. I hope you can see my PowerPoint. So I am going to, can you hear me well? Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to basically talk about some implications of what we are observing based on information that we have been working. So first, the situation today, as you know, there are key drivers that are moving food insecurity, which are conflict, now war, climate variability, and slowdowns and downturns. And these impacts continue to be there. Yesterday, we launched the SOFI, and we were talking of more than 800 million people still chronically undernourished, 848, which is mostly because of the COVID-19 impacts over economies and how that has accelerated the increase in the numbers of hunger in the world. But this, of course, is underlined by poverty and inequalities has been exacerbated. So it's not a problem just of the war in terms of food security and nutrition, it's also a problem of what was happening there. And this is just to show the relevance of those drivers. If we look at the food crisis countries, which basically are classified on IPC phase 3 or above, we are talking that we have moved from 108 million people in IPC 3 phase or above to 193 million people. And 72% of those are because of an issue of conflicts, internal conflicts, 16% because of slowdowns and downturns, and 12% because of climate change. And most of them are in sub-Saharan African, some South Asian countries and Central American countries. Now, one of the ways we are looking at this is to look at the resilience. And one of the indicators of resilience we have developed as part of the SOFA 2021 is what we call the Dietary Sourcing Flexibility Index for kilocalories. And basically what we try to do is to compare the diversity of imports and trade partners with how much they produce and the diversity of domestic production, and also the level of stocks that countries have. And what this means, if you move further from the diagonal, like in country B, you will have higher absorptive capacity because you will be more diversified and have higher stocks relative to a country A. And when we estimate that, what we found is, as expected, low-income countries and lower middle-income countries are closer to the zero, so they are closer to be having less capacity, but also upper middle-income countries, the light blue bubbles, and the size of the bubble is the level of stocks, are also not so resilient relative to high-income countries, which are, of course, at the top of greater absorptive capacity. Why is this so important? Because this reflects what we have observed in the world of cereals and how much being fully import dependent in the cereal world of one country or two could be extremely dangerous in terms of your absorptive capacity. Why this is so relevant in cereals? Because the world of cereals is highly concentrated. This was the concentration level in 2007, 2008, and 2011 for maize, the top 5, 84%, control 84% of exports. For wheat, 63%, for rice, 95%, and for paddy rice and for broken rice, 80%. And this means that very few countries control the majority of the exports. The same is happening today, but the difference today is that there has been significant shifts. This is a graph that was developed by DG Agri, by Tassos, where basically what he does is he shows how the combined change has mostly increased in the case of Russian Federation and Ukraine, where there has been a significant increase of plus 66 million metric tons between 1992 and 2019, while Africa and Asia has substantially decreased their export capacity in the case of wheat, and the others have more or less remained neutral. And that's why these two countries became 30% of the exports of cereals in the world and 61% of the exports of sunflower. Now, coming back to the absorption capacity, what we know now is that 50 of the 50 countries, which are mostly net food import dependent of wheat from Russian Federation and Ukraine, 30 of those have 50% of more of dependency. And that's make these countries very vulnerable. So they will be having low absorption capacity. Even more in the stars, what I'm doing is plugging the countries that are in food crisis. No, IPC 570,000 people, which is famine. 3 of the 6 countries in IPC 3 or above in orange star, and in the blue, which is 5 of the 7 countries with the highest number of internally displaced people. So even in those countries which are in critical conditions, they were also import dependent of these two countries. And one thing to pick up is that Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa is dependent, of course, on wheat consumption, but Sub-Saharan Africa is not. Their staples are cassava, rice, and white maize, not yellow maize. That's why it's light green here, where this is showing the kilocalorie per capita consumption of wheat per day. But these countries are affected not because exactly of wheat, but because of the overall increase in the food import bill, and mostly because of oilseeds and feedstock that really affects them. And the food import bill, so just to put things in context, of the 62 most vulnerable countries in the world is around today $24.5 billion of change in the food import bill. This means the increase of expenditures you need to cover to export or to import exactly what you were importing in the previous year to the war. Now, of course, if we look at the different crises around the world, all of them will be linked to commodity price waves. And in all of them, we will have also a relationship with energy, but which was not exactly the relationship we are observing today, but also with commodity prices. So that's really important to capture and to keep in mind. Now, what is happening in trade? In trade, what we are observing, and this is done by David Laborde from IFPRI, that in terms of the traded calories in the world, what happened in COVID-19 was a spike, and then it came down very quickly. In the food price crisis of 2007-2008, there was a spike up to close to 16%, and then it came down in a shorter period. But what we are observing today is an increase of a longer period, and close to more than 17% of the calories traded are being restricted. There was a small decline because of the removal of Indonesia palm oil export restriction, but that's the situation we are facing today, which is a little bit worrisome, and it's something that we need to share more information on availability of stock so that this comes down. Like what is happening right now, for example, that the wheat price has gone back to the level of December of 2021, not because there was more information on expected surpluses. And why is trade so important? Because if we look at the 9 food groups that we need to have healthy diets, Sub-Saharan Africa cannot afford, that doesn't have access to those 9 food groups. And that means that if we don't have trade, then they will never be able to have the level of healthy diets they need, as well as South Asia. Now, what are the updates, the latest updates that we have? First, in the case of wheat, we're starting to observe a decline in some of the prices because there has been a supply response. Although if we look at the stocks and we exclude from the stocks Ukraine and China, we are starting to see a decline of stocks relative to what we had before the war and before COVID-19, but it's still higher than what we have in 2007, 2008, or 2011. In the case of maize, something very, very similar. Production is slowing a little bit the same in the case of wheat. And this is more linked to the problem of fertilizers and the affordability of fertilizers. But again, we expect some potential supply response next year. The commodity which is worrisome for us is the case of rice. Why? Because if you look at the first graph, the FAO All Rice Price Index, the dotted line, which is until May, is the rice price index, which is starting to increase. And this was the only commodity that has a substantial surplus and was doing pretty well in terms of prices because it was not affected by the war and so on. But this is a result of the increasing cost of fertilizers. So this is really affecting producers of rice, which today are selling rice at a loss because of the significant increase in the cost of fertilizers. And here is where I think we need to be very worried. If this continues to increase, this could imply a significant problem for Sub-Saharan Africa, which is a really net importer of rice, and also for South Asia, of course. So this is a commodity that we are tracking very closely and we need to look at very carefully. And it's being substantially affected because of the affordability of the fertilizer prices. And this is the global rice production. As you can see, there is a reduction in the production in the last period, in the projected production. And that's what is creating some concerns in what we are doing. Now, in this context, the question is what to do, because in addition to the reduction of the share of exports from Russian Federation and Ukraine, both on wheat and maize, it's important to understand that today the gap in wheat is 3 million metric tons, the gap in maize is 8 million metric tons, so it's very small. So 2022 is not a problem of food availability, it's a problem of food access. In the case of sunflower, they export around 61% of the global share, but other countries have compensated, so sunflower prices are starting also to go down. The problem is next year because of the relationship between gas prices and fertilizer production, especially nitrogen. And Russian Federation is the first exporter of nitrogen, the second of potassium, and the third of phosphorus. Now, when you produce nitrogen, you need gas, and that's why some plants are closing in Europe. In the UK, already one plant closed. And in Europe, what will happen is that there will be substitution for local consumption from production of fertilizers. So EU was an exporter of nitrogen, and this could reduce the surpluses together with export restriction of Russian Federation. And that is putting pressure, even more pressure on the price of fertilizers. And that's something to be worried, because it could imply what is happening to the rice producers, but also in general, we could be facing a reduction of global yields for next year. So for us, the major concern right now is 2023, where we could be having a problem of food access, but also potentially of food availability, and then we will be in a bad situation. Because if you go to the most dramatic scenario, where the production from Ukraine reduces substantially, right now, if you look here, the reduction of wheat production, we are assuming close to 40% of what they used to produce. And for the case of maize, is around a little bit higher than 50%. But if we go even more dramatic and remove all the exports from Russian Federation and from Ukraine, if the war continues, plus a reduction in global yields because of the affordability issue of fertilizer, because of this new relationship with the energy sector, then again, we expect a significant increase in hunger and chronic undernourishment relative to what we had expected in 2022. So our models are saying an increase over the baseline with no conflict of around 30 million more people chronically undernourished in 2022. And in 2023, if this issue of yields applies, it could go in additional higher 17 million more people chronically undernourished relative to the baseline. So how we are looking at this in the minutes I have left. So we're looking at this in terms of risks and uncertainties. So of course you have the humanitarian part, which is basically to provide food to the most vulnerable people in the country, in Ukraine, outside Ukraine, and to help the people which are being displaced or migration because of the conflict. But then we have the sector, the food and agricultural sector, and the macroeconomic side. So on the food and agricultural sector, the major issues right now are on the input supply side, on fertilizers especially, but also, of course, on feedstock, on feed. For fertilizers, we just deploy, if you go to the Ukraine webpage of FAO, a tracker of what is remaining to be imported relative to the previous year of N, P, and K, so that we have an idea of which are the countries that are really still with significant gaps. Then the trade restrictions is another problem which could exacerbate situations. And the logistical part, which we have seen in the COVID-19, was important. And now it's also important because still we have a problem of congestion. And this will affect production and of course will affect prices. And that's what we are observing. Now, one thing that is important here to understand is that with the little gap that we have of wheat in 2022, if, for example, the 20 to 25 million metric tons of cereals that they have in stock in Ukraine right now, of which assume that 50% is wheat or a little bit less if we take out the wheat which is not top quality, if we are able to move out of Ukraine 5 million metric tons of wheat, for example, when the gap is 3, then and when the prices are already decreasing, that could create a different problem, which is farmers will be in trouble because of lower prices, and that will affect also their affordability for the next planting season. So we need to figure out very carefully, it's not just move out the grain. It's okay to purchase the grain because you want to support the Ukrainian farmers, but it's also how we can handle that grain so that we cannot create a bigger distortion. Because remember, there will be substantial subsidies to help the mobility of that grain, and that won't be materialized into the market price because of the transportation issues of moving this grain out and the risks and the insurance that are behind that. And finally, the issue of diseases is really important because Ukraine has African swine fever and other diseases. So we need to be very careful that this is not spread out. The macroeconomic part where the energy relationships come, we knew the energy relationship between biofuels and food, no? How biofuels compete with food and the problem of the mandates and how that should be changed to minimize those risks. But the new relationship that is found between gas and nitrogen production is something new, which brings and incorporates into the agricultural sector also the market of energy, which is a very complex market, not only because of what is happening now, but because of the potential change of the energy mix because of climate change. And what it's telling us, if we change the energy mix too abruptly without understanding the trade-offs, that could create a problem over the price of fertilizers in the future and a problem over hunger. And that's something to look at. The other element is the risk that countries have today because of vulnerabilities and reduction of debt. Significant debt doesn't allow them to be able to move. And of course, the exchange rate, which the dollar is becoming extremely stronger, and that implies an increase also in the import bill of countries. And finally, the nuclear contamination, which could remove completely from production Ukraine land, and again, that will materialize the scenario where there is no exports from this country. Finally, both of them under a context where we have water stress and where we have climate change. So the agricultural sector and the food systems, the agri-food systems, are operation under risk and uncertainty. And that's something that we need to carefully understand so that we can make policies that are linked to that. And these are some of the recommendations that we are working. The first one is directly linked to Ukraine. The second one is the food import financing facility, where basically we are arguing that the IMF should implement under the balance of payment financing facility, a facility just for food imports to compensate the $24.5 billion of increase in the food import bill for the 62 most vulnerable countries, which is around 1.7 billion people, just to minimize any potential risk of uncertainty. And if we do that at an interest rate of 4%, which is the one that applies today, that will mean a subsidy of around $1 billion to lend this money so that we minimize any potential risk. And then we are looking a lot to efficiency gains, not only in keeping trade open, but also more transparency of information and how we can improve the efficiency in fertilizers and reduction of food loss and waste, so that we have more availability in case the bad scenario of 2023 happens in terms of food availability. Okay, so let me stop there and thank you so much.
Maximo, thank you very much for this very comprehensive overview about the implication of this conflict. Now let's move to our next speaker, Alfons Balmann.
Yeah, hello everybody. I would now like to introduce you into the situation in Ukraine. You all know about the news, and I will not go into details about all the problems directly affecting the country with bombing, with the occupation of regions in Ukraine, etc. However, Ukraine, and that has already been mentioned, has become an important exporter of food, particularly of crops and fats and oils. Most of these products are, by the way, exported to Asia. China and India are huge importers of Ukrainian products. And a further large share is going to Europe. In Africa, that has been mentioned, there are mainly the Northern African countries which are suffering directly from lacking imports from Ukraine. But nevertheless, it has an impact on the world market prices, and that is the main issue currently. On the other hand, Ukrainian agriculture is very important for Ukraine as a country. 40% of all Ukrainian exports are agricultural exports and exports from the food industry. And that means also that this is something which should be considered. By the way, that Ukraine is now feeding the world is a rather recent phenomenon. If you look back 15 years, Ukraine was more or less neglectable as an exporter for agricultural products, and that Ukraine became such a huge exporter is result of substantial increases in production. So since 2007, Ukraine tripled the production of wheat, corn, and sunflowers, and this is particularly a result of an increase in yields. For example, for corn, Ukraine doubled the yields, and in addition to doubling the yields, also the area more and more focused towards, for example, the production of corn, much less on the production of wheat. It is, if we now want to assess the implications for future Ukrainian agriculture and production, it may be worth to have a look at the farm structures in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, the very, very most farms are household farms, which the size of, on average, 1.5 hectares. They farm together some 15% of the land, and according to official statistics, they are responsible for some 43% of the value of the products. I do not trust really in these figures because it's based on self-reporting, and it's also a question of valuation. However, these household farms are very important for the production of milk, the production of potatoes, and of all the ingredients of one of the main Ukrainian dish, which is borscht. Then family farms also are a certain group which farms some 10% of the land. These farms have on average some 70 hectares, and they are responsible also for some 10% of the production. The bulk of the production, however, is coming from corporate farms, which have on average a size of some 2,000 hectares. And among this group of corporate farms are subsidiaries of agro holdings, companies which farm sometimes several 100,000 hectares, and these subsidiaries of the agro holdings are responsible for 22% of the output. An example for such an agro holding is Canel, which is actually an oil processing company which also exports grain. But aside of these main activities, Canel farms some 500,000 hectares of land. And in Ukraine, you find a number of such holdings. Canel is the largest, but there are others which also farm far more than 100,000 hectares. In total, some 15 enterprises farm more than 100,000 hectares, but you also find companies with 10, 15,000 hectares within this group. Many of them, of the very large ones, are registered in the EU, by the way, but the main owners are in almost all cases Ukrainians, but they have their official registration in the EU, and some of them are listed on stock markets, particularly in Warsaw. The question is, how did these agro holdings emerge? And particularly I see two main drivers, and that are the food crises in 2007, 2008, and in 2011 to 2013. There were huge waves of international investments. Some of these holdings started IPOs to raise additional capital. Some placed bonds on European bond markets. There was a huge inflow of capital into Ukraine. But then in 2013, 2014, there came the Euromaidan. There was a political and financial crisis. Russia entered the Crimea, and also the war in the Donbas region started. But at the same time, there were lots of reforms, and particularly the government started to fight effectively corruption. And in this uncertain situation, the companies were forced to earn money from their business activities and were hardly able to raise funds from international financiers, with the exception of certain international banks. This led to a modernization of Ukrainian agriculture, and some of these companies are now highly digitalized companies. The question is this a success story? And if you look, for example, at productivity of companies like IMC, which harvest now some 10 to 11 tons of corn per hectare, or 3.5 tons of sunflower, this is on an international level, given the local production conditions. And these companies also are some 30 to 50% more productive than the Ukrainian average. And in recent years, these farms became also very profitable. For example, Canel or IMC had an EBITDA per hectare of some 900 US dollar, and net profit in the case of IMC of some 600 US dollar per hectare. And even during this wartime, these companies engage in further modernization of agriculture. They are engaged and collaborating with international companies to test and implement new technologies, which are partly even not available on the international markets. Let me now come to the war directly. You all know in the eastern part of Ukraine, there is the war, but we also have to be aware that there were some regions in the northern part of Ukraine which were occupied until end of March. And the question is now, what does that mean for current agriculture in Ukraine? We have to be aware, if we look at this border, which I just introduced, some of the most productive regions are affected. And that is, on the one hand, the northern part, which is responsible particularly for crop production, corn and partly also wheat, but also for the oilseed crops. And what does it mean actually in Ukraine? On the one hand, there are farms and elevators under fire, affected by the war. There are mines on farmland, on the previously occupied areas, but also sometimes even apart from the front. There is a lack of inputs for farms, particularly fuels is a problem. There is financial stress of farms, particularly a lack of liquidity. There are destroyed infrastructures such as bridges and roads, and there is this blockage of the harbors. And recently there are also some reports that grains are stolen from these occupied areas and shipped away. You may eventually know also the news on these issues. What does that mean for Ukrainian crop production? So in the current war areas, I suppose there's almost no production. In the former war areas, most summer crops have been planted, but there were problems with mines and destroyed infrastructure so that some fields could not be planted. And we also have to expect yield gaps due to delays in seeding, for example, and also due to limited access to inputs. In the central and western parts of Ukraine, problems are much less important. There are certain yield gaps as well due to the delays and also limited access to inputs. The estimated decline in production, Maximo already mentioned some figures. So for example, in wheat, it's expected that instead of 33 million tons, Ukraine this year will just harvest 21 million, corn 27 instead of 38, sunflower 9 instead of 16 million tons. So that means that Ukraine may have an export potential of 32 million tons instead of almost 50 million tons in 2021, but there may be some current stocks which could not be sold in the current season. And that brings me to the biggest problem of Ukraine, that is export logistics. Here you see the monthly exports of Ukraine, and you see that since the beginning of the war, Ukraine is only exporting about 1 million ton per month compared to 4 to 6 million tons in the previous months, and that will hardly be possible to increase because there are only 10 railway routes which can replace the blocked harbors in the south in Odessa and Mykolaiv, so that Ukraine may only be able to export 1.1 million tons per or via railway routes and eventually via the roads, something additionally. The one key problem is that the gauge of the trains in the former Soviet Union and in the EU is different, so that the trains cannot directly drive further over the border. And that has implications also for crop prices in Ukraine. So here you see the wheat price, for example, for May in central Ukraine, which was just about 180 to 190 euro, which was half of what the world market price was for corn. It was even worse for sunflower. It looks a little bit better, but also not much more than half of the world market price. And that is just of the high transportation cost and because of the bottleneck at the borders. And that leads to the question what to expect. For the farms, I would expect that there are lower production, there will be lower prices for the farms, and they have higher costs, for example, for energy. And that will lead to a reduced profitability and financial distress of family and corporate farms. We also have this logistics problem, which is the key issue which needs to be solved to overcome the key problems. And that depends very much on the continuation and outcome of the war. And we have to be afraid that the farming season 2022-23 may become much worse for the farmers compared to the current situation, particularly due to financial stress. What to expect, I only would refer to some of the results of the Ukraine Recovery Conference in the beginning of this week. I suppose everybody is aware that there is a high need to support Ukraine, and there is also a very high awareness to support the agricultural sector in Ukraine as one of the key sectors. So about 2/3 of the expected funding needs for the economy are or maybe reserved for the agricultural sector. Okay, and surely another part will be necessary with regard to overcoming the bottleneck of the logistics, because we don't know how the logistics situation will develop in Ukraine, because that depends very much on the outcome of the war and also on the continuation. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Alfons, for providing some deep insights into what's going on in the Ukraine and what to expect there. Now, our next speaker will be Roel Jongeneel.
Thank you. After having heard, say, more a world perspective from Maximo and the talk of Alfons going more into the details for the Ukraine, what I would like to do is to focus, to give you some insights into this study we did from the impacts on the Netherlands, say, as a typical EU member state, you could say, which I worked on with several co-authors, also Minna, who's in the room here. So when the war started, we did several studies in our institute for the Dutch government. It started with say some short-term impacts because farmers were say going to the government that there was a big crisis and that the government had to jump in. We did also a study more on short-term impacts on food security, a little bit like what Maximo was telling, with a focus on the MENA countries and Asia. But what I would like you to tell a bit about is now the medium-term impact on the Netherlands, taking into account that the Netherlands is part of the EU. And here you see also a picture of the study, which will be sent to Parliament today, actually, or tomorrow. That's Parliament. So what we did, we learned already some from the talk of Alfons that there is a lot of uncertainty also how the war will go on. And the best thing to do then is to explore a number of scenarios. So we had as a baseline scenario the outlook, medium-term outlook of the Commission, and the link to that member state outlook that we are producing. And then as a first scenario, we had the Ukraine war, where we simulated the direct impacts of on production and trade from the Ukraine, how that impacted agricultural markets and also the situation in the Netherlands. Then we looked at a similar scenario, but now we added an EU policy response, because as you might know that the EU decided to temporarily allow member states to include, let fallow land coming back into production. And as a consequence, trying to reduce the scarcity, say those. And then the third scenario is focusing more on the energy nexus, that we also look to what will the energy prices, increase energy and fertilizer prices. Also, when you take into account what you would expect this to happen, say, on agricultural production and consumption worldwide. Here a graph for, say, more our academically interested thing. Of course, if you are going to study with scenarios, you are analyzing, say, you're using a model. And what is typically in models is that they include the inputs in terms of a kind of a cost index. There are very few models, I don't know them at least, which have a very detailed representation of the energy, say, and fertilizer costs in the thing. So so was our model. So we saw that it's too rough for this type of analysis. So that's what we did. We went into, say, more had a more detailed and also micro-based assessment of what is actually happening at the trade-off. And this is very important. First, and that's what you see in this figure, where you have a production function, say, with at the vertical axis, the production, say, of wheat, and the horizontal axis, the input fertilizer. What's of course important is what is changing, what is driving the farmer behavior, and it's the relative prices. We know that it's relative prices. So what's very, very interesting is then to look what is actually at the margin, what is the elasticity of, say, fertilizer application with respect to yield. And we came to an elasticity of about 1/3. Note that this would mean that when at the margin, fertilizer application would go down with 15%, the yield will only go down with 5% if this story is say valid. So at the margin, there is room for maneuver, and you see still that there is, in a lot of European countries, there is actually, I would say, kind of an implicit oversupply of fertilizer. So when you would reduce it, that's a thing. So that's about the elasticity at the margin. The second thing is about the importance of fertilizer in terms of the cost of production. Actually, that's not that high. So for example, when you have an increase of the fertilizer price with 30%, if you would only have an increase of the, say, wheat price of 5%, it would already create a favorable margin. So then there would be no incentive for the farmer to reduce the fertilizer application even when if the fertilizer prices have increased with 30%, if you could expect a little bit increase of the yield price. And that's actually what you are seeing also when you look in the field. A lot of farmers are at the margin, they are doing something, but they are not, in particular in Northern Europe, they are not changing, at least to my, what I've seen, so much their behavior. So we took that into account in our modeling analysis. So the yield impacts, we carefully took that into account. So we replaced more or less, say, our cost index thing with a more precise estimate here. Now, let me give you then say, a flavor of the main results. What we found for the Netherlands is that the impacts, medium-term impacts of the Ukraine war are relatively minor. They are there for the first year. We looked at the period 22-25. So we made also some assumptions with, of course, the uncertainty about the containment of the conflict and coming production in coming back into areas coming back into production, with a net in 2025, say that still we have a gap of 30%, something like that. And I think that outcome is quite explainable in the case of the Netherlands, because the trade dependency of the Netherlands on the Ukraine was generally relatively low. With one exception is sunflower, and another exception would be organic feed. And of course, the trade more generally was already limited, because we have already since 2014, the Russian invasion of the Crimea, we have already a ban with Russia, which already reduced the trade, I think. What we also saw is that the EU policy measure to allow temporarily fallow land coming back into production, actually, it's more a symbolic thing than it really matters. It increases some area, but it's less than 3%, and it's often areas which have a lower value of production. So we don't see that that's changing the story. What we saw is that one of the most say intriguing things is the energy fertilizer part. So that's really what's important. That's also why we delved into the micro stuff there a bit, to get our sectoral models, say, better calibrated to this. But what you see there also is that the impact of the Ukraine war in itself, it's not the complete story. So the sanctions of the EU and the energy tensions, I think, are more adding to the general price increases. Because what you could say that in advancing, just before the Ukraine war, we saw already a lot of commodity prices increasing. So the war did not add, of course, it did temporarily add price increases, but it's only part in a trend that was already there. Now, then, of course, policymakers are also always interested in, does there something on food security? Now, for the Netherlands, and I think not for the EU as a whole, there's no threat of food security. Okay, thank you.
Yes. Roel, thank you very much for showing the implications on a small country, but implications for larger countries as well. Thank you very much. Now the next speaker, Vincent Smith.
But I'm just going to sit here and yell at you all because it will be fun. And we have not had enough fun this afternoon. General equilibrium models, which I sat through, are not fun. They may be needed, but they sure as heck aren't fun. I really want to recognize that my main focus here is on the short run, not the long run. And so some of my thoughts were actually conditioned by a discussion with one of our colleagues here from Israel on Tuesday, I think, afternoon. And this has framed the discussion that I want to carry out. The impact of the Ukraine crisis, and I don't have to be political, I'm too darned old. It's just a colonial war of aggression for greed and power. And just recognizing that is something I think we all probably agree with, but let's just say it. I want to talk about what has happened in the three key agricultural commodity markets, which does not involve rice, whatsoever. Rice is a completely independent world as a result of the Ukraine crisis. And I want to illustrate what has happened with two simple tables. Oh, how do I do this? Help. Oh, sorry. I'm technologically incompetent. So the first table, and this is really important, concerns commodity prices. If you look at the period January 21 through January 22, for wheat in particular and soybeans, most of the price increase that is misattributed in the press and even by some economists to the Ukraine crisis had already occurred. So the Ukraine crisis impacts, at least short term, are reflected by the additionality on top of already very substantially higher than expected prices. Richard Gray would already be a happy camper if he's raising wheat on his Canadian farm with a $6.50 US dollar price. These are US dollars. So by April, wheat prices had jumped to 11 to 13. And over the period from February 24th, the date of the invasion, through that period, were highly volatile and almost certainly influenced the volatility derived from essentially rumor, assertion, and to some extent panic. And the same is true for soybeans. You see soybeans were 1090 January 21, increased 20% essentially by 22, but did jump considerably more by April 22nd. And the third column shows you what prices were today in cash markets in the US. So these are all US-based prices, which I make little apology for because they're indicative of world prices. Notice what's happened to corn. It's dropped by effectively $2. Wheat has dropped by $4 if we take the low end of that 11 to 13 range. But soybeans have not changed at all. They have remained high, which raises the question, what is different about soybeans? Now, the other issue that is important in a global context, because my focus is going to be on who is being hurt by the Ukraine crisis beyond the borders of Ukraine. Alfonso's discussion was fabulous about what is going on in Ukraine. Let's take a quick look at fertilizer prices. Fertilizer prices in June of 2021 for urea, the primary nitrogen fertilizer, at least in the United States, was $527 a ton. By January, it had gone to $916 a ton. And interestingly, it only jumped by about $30 to $40 by April the 22nd. Potash prices have doubled and have remained high. And of course, prices for potash have been affected by Belarus's engagement in the war on basically the side of Mr. Putin. DAP is a phosphate fertilizer representative. Between June and January, before the beginning of the war, prices had gone up about 50%. They increased through April by about another 10%, let's say. So the war has mattered for these prices. But interestingly, for wheat and for corn, prices have significantly moderated in cash markets. And if you look at the out prices in the futures markets, for wheat, you're looking at $6, say for September or December delivery on a futures contract. And for corn, you're down to $5 or less. These are moving back to where they should be. Now, as an aside, I am not putting up the data on global production, but world board forecasts by the USDA indicate that the 21-22 crop for wheat and the 21-22 crop for corn are going to be virtually no less or even a little bit larger than they were in the previous year. So the loss of production that Alfons described is estimated by what I think of as the best forecasting group in the world on these issues to be completely offset by production elsewhere. And that shows up in the prices. Just on the fertilizer prices, what is critical to understand about fertilizer prices is that they are somewhat interrelated. If you look, and this is work based on a short paper that Gary Bresser and I put together. If you look in the US at the price of natural gas, which is roughly estimated as 80% of the variable cost of producing fertilizer, natural gas prices went from $3 per million BTU to $6 per million BTU. They doubled before there was any incursion into Ukraine. That by itself is a significant supply shock. So the fertilizer price is largely, the price increase is largely a supply shock, not a demand shock. It is related, of course, though, to the war, especially post February 24th, because the blue line that's up there, that's what happened to European gas prices, which were already surging between, point? Do I have to? No wonder, yeah, change my slide. The blue line, God, I'm so pathetic. The blue line is what happened to natural gas prices in the European Union. And let's not kid ourselves. Natural gas prices were surging in the European Union. I actually occasionally read British media, particularly the BBC, and the number of articles about poor British households not being able to heat themselves during this coming winter have been rather low. So the war has made for fertilizers matters worse. But I was fascinated by what our previous speaker had to say about the Netherlands, because what is true for the Netherlands is also true for the United States. If you double the price of wheat and you double the price of fertilizers, you have actually only increased costs of production for wheat by about $20 a ton. And for all these increases in the prices of fertilizer, when aggregated on a typical acre of wheat in the US, shift spending on fertilizer from about $25 to about $50 a ton. The increase in the price of wheat, which essentially farmers are not stupid and they've locked into these higher prices, doubled, meaning $200 a ton. $200 an acre, I should say, basically $200 a ton in additional revenues. So if your fertilizer costs have gone up by, let's say 25, your energy costs have gone up by another 30 or 40, you're still gonna want to plant a lot of wheat. And the story for corn is a little more complex, but it's not that different. The question that's of interest is, why are soybean prices not moderating? Why are oilseed prices are not moderating? And for a monthly outlet that I edit with Joe Glauber from AEI called The Monthly Harvest, we asked Aaron Smith at UC Davis to do an analysis of why oilseed prices have not surged. Clearly, sunflower has surged, but sunflower is about 10% of global vegetable oil supply. His story is a renewable fuel standard story in the United States that has led to an increase in the use of oil seeds for the production of biodiesel, of bioenergy, biofuels, pushed heavily by California's relatively recent standards. So we start thinking about why are soybean prices and other vegetable oil prices, as shown in a different piece by David Laborde and Joe Glauber, not moderating? It's because Putin's war of aggression is not the dominant force there. It is a force, but it's not the dominant force. And now let me flip a little bit to what I personally think is the most important question. Throughout many parts of Africa, which depend on maize as well as wheat, the issue is what will happen, what do we need to do as rich countries to help address the poor countries' needs? Countries, you pick whichever country you want. And I think the straightforward answer is we have to rely on substantial increases in international food aid. And the US Congress has actually approved a $2.8 billion increase in the funds available for that to be used over the next 12 months. They did that not long after the end of the war. So just fundamentally, we need to be good global citizens. There is an issue in the United States, and it's an issue that I've spent a lot of time on in terms of research work. The US has an arcane and really rather evil set of regulations requiring at least half of all food be carried on US ships and all food aid be sourced in the United States. That effectively, and Chris Barrett in his work and I and Stephanie Mercier in my work, both find that wastes a 30% of the food aid budget. If you think about $2.8 billion and call it $800 million going out the window because of rent seeking by companies like Maersk US, so that is Maersk, by the way, and companies like Liberty US. We're talking about those folks trying to manipulate the system at the cost of literally millions of lives. It's astonishingly an evil policy. I have to say that most of the EU does not do that, and Canada has heavily reformed its system. Richard probably knows more about that than I do. This is a really critical issue. And thank God, at least in the Senate, there are proposals to waive cargo preference for the next 3 years, being pushed all the way up to Mitch McConnell, who's the leading Republican in the Senate, not, I'm afraid, the leading Democrat in the Senate, whose friends run Liberty, but that's just politics. But it may well occur. So this is where I see, in the short run, a really important set of issues. Finally, and I know I've run out of time almost certainly, I want to put in 2 addendums. There's this notion that just because Morocco has in recent history got its wheat from the Black Sea, Morocco won't be able to access grain. But what nonsense. If you go back and look at 95, 90, almost all of the grain coming to North Africa came out of the European Union and especially the United States. Ships don't just follow on one route, and markets arbitrage. The only problem with the supply chain disruption is whether or not there's a significant increase on a per ton basis in transportation costs. And quite likely, it's not that large. It's not zero, but it's not that large as an additional cost for 2 reasons. One, because shipping a ton of grain on average costs about $60 or $70, according to Will Martin's recent estimates. And 2, most of that is tied up with loading and unloading rather than actually moving the grain. So we need to stop talking about grain movements and the shipment of exports as if if you don't have source X, you can't get it from source Y. What we need to be talking about is, what does that imply in the need for food aid for countries like Eritrea, like Malawi? You pick your favorite very poor country, and how do we address their needs? Back of the envelope, Dan Sumner says the additional cost of getting the food, of getting what we previously been sending to those countries in food aid around the globe is about $2 billion. That may or may not be right, but it's an interesting ballpark. Now, the evidence on soybeans and vegetable oils says clearly in the short run that food needs compete with biofuels needs for the same commodity. And so if we are to address this issue, and we want to see, at least for the next 20 or 30 years, a substantial part of the energy we put in our cars and so on, sourcing from biofuels, there is only one way to go. You can mess at the margin with tax policy. You can mess at the margins with, well, don't do this. Don't do organic. That does not solve any problem. Just plucking acres to yields that are half the current level is not a good idea, at least from a food security basis. What you do need is for the EU and the US to get off their butts and stop reducing investments in farm-level based R&D that would generate better products. You also need the EU to grow up, as exactly was explained by Richard Roberts in the opening session, and stop having spurious regulations based on nonsense precautionary principle bases that are simply a way of preventing the use of current, more efficient, less risky technologies to produce new crops. So that's my message. And I did say I'd yell. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Vince, for also your lasting, challenging comments.